Um, I'd like to begin by acknowledging, as we always do, that we're meeting here in Australia on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. Sovereignty of this land was never ceded. This land was taken without consent, without treaty, and without compensation. I pay my respects to elders and leaders, past, present, and emerging, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, traditional owners, and First Nations all across this continent. I'm on Gundungurra and Darug land here in the Blue Mountains, where we say Warami Gamarada, welcome comrades. Very excited to have Jim Stanford with us today for our first daytime search webinar for a very long time. But before we get into that, first I'll tell everyone about the event, then give a 30-second intro to search, and then 1 minute introduction to Jim Stanford. He'll then speak, and then after that we'll have questions, which I encourage you to submit in the Q&A section. The chat section is also open. Please use it responsibly, and then we'll wrap up on the hour. Participants are muted unless you're called upon to ask a question. Please let me know if you would like to ask your question yourself or would like to have that asked on your behalf by myself. So a quick intro to Search. Search is a membership-based democratic socialist organisation that links and enables socialist activists across different progressive movements, political parties and generations. Our members come from diverse backgrounds and from all around Australia, and indeed we have some members overseas as well, but we have common aims and values summarised in our goal of democratic ecological socialism. We run socialist education programs. We publish news and views at search.org.au and publish those online on our social media platforms as well. And we put on events like this one. I encourage you to like the Search Facebook and Twitter pages to keep up with our events, and go to search.org.au if you're interested in applying for membership, or simply get in touch with me to talk about what Search does. Our contact details are on the website and our Facebook page. Now, to introduce our guest for today, Jim Stanford. Jim is the author of countless academic and popular articles on economics, trade, workers' rights, industrial relations, economic history, and policy. His book, Economics for Everyone, is one example of his years of dedication to education for trade unionists and progressive activists. Jim has been demystifying and democratizing economic knowledge, providing the research and evidence to change policies that hurt working people and the environment, advocating and being an activist across 2 continents for many years. His formal introduction bio, Dr. Jim Stanford is an economist and director of the Centre for Future Work, based at the Australia Institute. He has served as the director of the centre since its founding in 2016. He received his PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research in New York, and he also holds an MPhil from Cambridge University and a BA Honours from the University of Calgary. He's, as mentioned, the author of Economics for Everyone, A Short Guide to the Economics of Capitalism. The second edition published by Pluto Books in 2015, which has been published in 6 languages. He's written, edited or co-edited 5 other books and dozens of articles and reports in both peer-reviewed and popular outlets. He maintains an active presence on social media with his Twitter and Facebook accounts, and I'll post the was at Jimbo Stanford and Jimbo Stanford on Facebook. I'll put that in the chat as well. He's an honorary professor of political economy at the Department of Political Economy at the University of Sydney, and the Harold Innes Industry Professor in Economics at McMaster University in Hamilton, Canada. He's designed and taught numerous courses on economics for academic and non-academic audiences, including a unique week-long popular education course in economics for trade union members, which he delivered in Canada, the US, Australia, and New Zealand. And I know some people on the webinar today are graduates of that program. It's a great pleasure and privilege to have you here today, Jim, to speak on wages, prices, and the risks of monetary austerity. Working people are seeing their real wages decline rapidly, and governments everywhere are threatening to cut incomes and services to tame inflation. But what's causing inflation? Who's benefiting from it? And how can we solve it without austerity? That's the question for you, Jim. Over to you.
Luke, thank you very much, my friend. That was a very generous introduction. I liked your bit at the beginning the best, to tell you the truth. We could have skipped the rest. Demystifying and democratizing economics. That's a beautiful phrase, and I'm gonna steal that and use it in the future, because that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to, through our work at the Center for Future Work and all of our popular economic literacy initiatives, we're trying to put economics back in the hands of working people, and be able to use economics on our side instead of having it used against us as a hammer. You know, all the time it seems that whatever working people are demanding whether it's better wages and conditions at work, or stronger public services in the community, or a sustainable environment, we're always told it's somehow violating the laws of economic nature. It's not viable, it's not feasible, it's not fiscally responsible. And, if I can use the technical term in economics for that, it's all bullshit. Bullshit is a technical term in economics. It means hypothesis unsubstantiated by empirical verification. Okay, so this claim that what workers want is not feasible is just bullshit. And they use economics as a weapon, a very ideological weapon against us. And our goal is to empower workers with enough knowledge and enough confidence, frankly. In my experience, it's the confidence as much as anything else. You don't need to know a certain formula or know how the national accounts fit together or so on. It's good to learn those things, but it's more the confidence that working people are the economy. They are the ones who get their asses out of bed every Monday morning and go off and do a job and produce real goods and services. They add way more value added to the economy than any paper trader on the financial markets. And having the confidence to know that we have the legitimacy and the power to demand a better economy is what it's all about. So I'm really pleased to join the Search session. I am a member of Search myself, and a proud member of Search. It's a wonderful organization. I love the emphasis on education, the non-sectarianism of the movement, the great strides you've made engaging young people in what Search is doing. I just think it's marvelous, and very, very proud to be a member. So I'm going to share a few slides and go through a bit of a presentation on wages, prices, and the coming fights that we're going to have over it all. And then I'll look forward to any discussions and questions afterwards. So Luke, just give me the thumbs up that screen came through okay. Good. Tightening the screws. That's where we're at. And all of the research that we do at the center in our own name and with our partners is available on our website there, open access, and there's my Twitter handle and the center's Twitter handle. You're welcome to post from this presentation today if you'd like, and I will share the slides with Luke afterwards, and you're welcome to post it or distribute it however you'd like. I do want to make reference to this paper that we worked on with the ACTU that was published last week, An Economy That Works for People. This, I think, is, a very decent, very progressive vision of how some of the major features of neoliberalism have to be reversed and undone in order to reach an economy that has full employment or something very, very close to it, decent jobs, inclusion and fairness, and sustainability environmentally, but also economically in terms of inflation and stable prices and so on. And the only way to get that is to really fundamentally question some of the assumptions that have been governing our economy throughout the neoliberal era. Frankly, regardless of what party was in power, this is a bigger issue than what party is in power. It does matter what party's in power, it sure does, but some of these fundamental assumptions, like the idea that you have to preserve a certain desirable level of unemployment. It's gone by various names in history. This pool of unemployed who are there all the time to discipline workers, ensure that they obey commands at the workplace, do not ask for too much in the way of wages. It's currently called the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or NIRU. That's a real mouthful. And Milton Friedman called it the natural rate of unemployment, which is obviously a self-evidently ideological construct, the idea that unemployment is somehow natural. Somebody else beforehand, I forget his name, called it the reserve army of labor. So whatever you call it, this idea that you have to maintain a pool of unemployed workers to keep the whole system in control has been governing us. And we're now at a moment where that assumption is under attack, if you like, because the unemployment rate has come down. We are not at full employment in Australia. We're nowhere near full employment, but the unemployment rate has come down compared to where it used to be, and workers feel a lot more confident that they can find and keep a job. And that is a revolutionary seed, if you like. The minute that this work or starve, obey orders or get fired logic that usually governs the labor market in our economy, the moment that is taken away, employers start to worry, and the financiers start to worry. And it sometimes comes out as a discussion about inflation and how do we control inflation, but it's more a question of how do they control us, is what it's actually about. And I thought I was very proud of the ACTU for, very glad that they came to us for help with this paper, but also proud that they were willing to push the envelope in this way. And they got a lot of pushback from the usual suspects, the Australian Financial Review and the Australian and some of the conventional economists and so on. But I think it's a really good sign that the union movement is fighting for these policies. This is the first of 6 papers, I think, that the ACTU is going to publish before the jobs summit that the new government is hosting in Canberra at the beginning of September. And the other papers will look at other issues. This is the one that we worked on through our center, and I recommend it. You can reach it through our site or through the ACTU site, and I'll be talking in part about some of those things. We're in a situation right now where, after the dramatic events of the pandemic, the ups and downs of the pandemic, obviously the health fears, the lockdowns, the initial very steep recession, the steepest recession we've ever experienced, but luckily a short recession, and we came flying back economically with thanks to enormous public resources that were invested in the recovery. Now we're in a situation where they're clamping it all back down again, tightening the screws, if you like, in what I call monetary austerity. Monetary austerity means austerity coming from the central bank rather than from the government per se. Not fiscal austerity in the sense of big cutbacks in spending that we've become used to, but monetary austerity in the sense of clamping down on monetary conditions and the flow of credit through higher interest rates in order to slow down the whole economy, with the goal of getting back to that so-called NAIRU, the level of unemployment that is beneficial and desirable. And the goal is clearly to disempower workers and prevent us from trying to win higher wages and reduce inflationary pressures throughout the economy that had nothing to do with workers. For example, I know today is a hot news day with Scott Morrison's news conference. That was the most bizarre thing I've ever seen. Holy cow. But at the same time, the ABS released the latest wage price data. Wages increased by all of 2.6% over the last 12 months, despite this supposedly very overheated labor market. 2.6% nominal wage increases at a time that inflation is 7%. So real wages have declined significantly in Australia over the last year by around 4%, which is a significant drop just in 1 year, and there's more to come. So despite that, they're saying no, workers have to tighten their belts even a little bit more. I know this hurts, but I know it's good for you. This is what the RBA and its defenders are saying to us. So let's take a look at what's going on with wages and prices and the macro economy. This is the uptick in inflation that we've seen in the period since the lockdowns. Typically, inflation is around 2 or 3%. The RBA is supposed to keep it at 2.5% per year. They missed that consistently from one side, from 2014 through late 2019. 6 years in a row, they missed it from below. And there were no hue and cry about the RBA failing at its job. Inflation was too low. And the 2.5% is not a ceiling, it's a target. And it's based on a very unbelievable economic assumption, but it's based on an economic assumption that 2.5% inflation is optimal. It's a little bit of inflation to keep the wheels greased in the economy, but not too much inflation to worry the financiers and others that their financial wealth is being dissipated. So, very, very one-sided in a way. Now that we've had a few months of inflation above that target, then suddenly the world is going to come to an end unless we get inflation back to 2.5%. And what the Reserve Bank is saying is they'll increase interest rates and do whatever it takes. They literally say, do whatever it takes to get inflation back to 2.5%. And that means they're willing to have a recession. They are willing to have a recession. They will see that as a legitimate price. It reminds me of the US general in Vietnam who said, we have to destroy this village in order to save it. And that's kind of the philosophy that the RBA is taking to this inflation battle. Now, inflation is a problem, particularly when wages are growing so slow. If wages and social benefits were all indexed fully and keeping up with inflation, then it wouldn't necessarily be a problem. But when wages are suppressed, as they are by a whole generation of anti-labor, union hostile, restrictive, insecure work policies, then things have been bad enough during that that several years period when wages were growing slow and inflation was very low, that wasn't a good time for workers. That was a bad time for workers. But this is a bad time for workers as well, because now real wages are falling significantly. How do we understand this inflation? This is very, very different from the 1970s inflation. And we could have a good discussion about the 1970s inflation. There's a lot of stereotypes that are not valid about it. But it was a time when workers were powerful and their power was growing and real wages were growing and workers' share of the GDP was growing and unions were growing and becoming more militant and business was on the defensive. Now, that was the experience in the 1970s. Today, it's the opposite on every one of those criteria. And this is an economy that's dominated by business, where business has the upper hand, where huge oligopolies like the supermarket chains or the energy companies or property developers have got power to jack up prices. And it's a very different scenario. So how do we understand this inflation? Some of it is clearly a transitory outcome of the pandemic and all the disruptions from the pandemic. Major problems in supply chains for certain commodities like semiconductors and cars and other supplies, and those problems are going to continue. If anyone watches what's happening in China, if anyone sees the rivers in Europe that have dried up so they can't transport goods, that's a supply chain problem right there. So this supply chain disruption is related to the pandemic, but there's also something deeper about the problems of a just-in-time global supply chain economy that we're going to have to rethink. We've also seen a surge in consumer spending after the pandemic, after the lockdowns. On average, household income in Australia increased during the pandemic, which seems weird. It seems counterintuitive since we had a recession, but it was because of government payments such as JobKeeper and the coronavirus supplement and so on. Total household income actually increased. Now, that didn't happen for everyone. There's a lot of people who suffered and a lot of people who were worse off, but on average, there's still a lot of spending power out there. Also, the fact that during the pandemic, people stopped traveling and eating in restaurants, and they started buying building supplies to renovate their home or home electronics to watch Netflix during the lockdown. And that caused some outbreaks of inflation. Of course, the energy price shock has been the single biggest cause of the inflation over the last year, supposedly due to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but don't believe that. Okay, world oil supply wasn't cut when Putin invaded Ukraine. In fact, world oil supply has increased since Putin invaded Ukraine. It's the operation of very speculative global futures markets for world oil prices that drove up the price just because of fear and expectations and speculation. And it happens all the time. You can have, one boat attacked in the Persian Gulf and the oil price will jump up to $100 US a barrel the next day just on speculation. It's like a stock market or a financial market. It isn't related to real supply and demand. And the upside, the short story for Australia, most of the energy that's consumed in Australia is produced in Australia. It has nothing to do with Putin and Ukraine. It's all about how our energy system, our privatized, deregulated energy system, is integrated into that speculative global futures market. So the energy companies in Australia, majority foreign owned, of course, are making out like bandits from the higher prices that Australians are paying for their petrol, for their electricity, for their gas. And again, it's got nothing to do with Putin and everything to do with capitalism. These were the initial sparks for the inflation, and it's kind of broadened out. You see most commodities now increasing prices at 4 or 5 or 6% now. The RBA says inflation is going to peak above 6%, probably around 7% later this year, and then start to fall. And we are already seeing some signs that the global inflation has peaked. All kinds of things. The energy is falling, agricultural prices are falling, shipping costs are falling. So while inflation is a big concern and workers have to fight to protect themselves, we shouldn't buy into this idea that the world is about to end because of an upsurge in inflation, given the unique circumstances of the pandemic. It is going to come back down, and come back down, I suspect, surprisingly quickly. That doesn't mean we don't look at it and try to protect ourselves against it. The one-note song that is being sung by the RBA and by central bankers around the world is that their duty and responsibility, again, it may hurt, but it's good for us, is to jack up interest rates, reduce overall growth and job creation and spending power, and bring inflation back down. And this is what's happening. We've seen over 50 countries increasing interest rates. Not everyone. Japan hasn't. The Europeans have barely touched theirs. China has cut theirs. So not everyone's doing it, but most countries are. The RBA is really now among one of the leaders in terms of how aggressively they're moving. This sums up the major banks that have been adjusting interest rates recently, and the Reserve Bank has increased it 4 times now by a total of 1.75 percentage points, and they're going to do it again. September 6th, rest assured. It'd be at least another half point or maybe even more. The Canadians have been the leaders in this race, I'm ashamed to say. The Americans, likewise, very aggressive. And they all say that even though they believe that the factors behind the initial inflation were related to one-time effects with the pandemic and so on, they are all singing from the same hymn book, the old neoliberal hymn book, that their one and only job is to keep inflation at its target, regardless of what else goes on. And it's that unilateral elevation of inflation control as the be-all and end-all of macroeconomic policy. That is actually how neoliberalism started. Neoliberalism started in the late 70s with the Volcker interest rate shock, when they explicitly abandoned full employment as the major economic goal and said, no, controlling inflation is it. And in recent years, central banks have been a bit more nuanced in what they've done, especially since the global financial crisis. But right now, they are back to basics and drinking that same Kool-Aid from the late 1970s, prepared to throw the whole economy into a recession if that's what it takes. And this is driven primarily by the interests of the financial community, who don't want to see inflation increase on a long-term basis. If the goal actually was just to reduce inflation, it's not clear that this in and of itself is doing it. Some things like housing become more expensive when you increase interest rates. Even though property prices are starting to fall, the overall cost of buying a house is higher because of the huge increase in interest expenses. And rents are going through the roof, even though interest rates are high and property prices are falling. Interest rates will have zero impact on those supply chain disruptions. If anything, I would say a negative impact, because it's going to discourage investment in any of those things, like more capacity or infrastructure or fixing the ports and the railways. All of that becomes more expensive when interest rates are high. But the ultimate goal is to throw a big bucket of ice water over the whole economy, reduce people's capacity to spend, and that will bring down inflation. Eventually, it absolutely will, at an enormous cost, and with workers being the collateral victims of it, because we didn't cause that inflation, but we're going to pay for it through a contraction of the overall macroeconomy. So the view increasingly, even among mainstream economists, is we're going to see a recession in the next 2 years. Typically, it takes 12 to 18 months to feel the full impact of higher interest rates, but in some cases, you see it faster with the downturn in financial markets, the downturn in property prices that will gain momentum, and some of the other more speculative assets. Cryptocurrency, of course, has collapsed, as we all knew that it would. That was all a con game from the beginning, and all it takes is some bad news to bring it down, and crypto and other similarly speculative assets are collapsing. And you could see that spread into the rest of the banking system. The banking system does not seem to be as fragile as it was at the time of the GFC, but it is still fragile. Believe me, every dollar that they've got in secure assets in a bank, they have lent it out 30 or 40 or 50 times through the leveraged credit system, and they are ultimately still very fragile if it goes south very badly. So where do wages fit into this? We've heard a lot about this wage price spiral and how we cannot go back to the bad old days of the 1970s. Sally McManus called it, she said this was a boomer fantasy, or more likely a boomer nightmare. For most people who weren't even around in the 1970s, so they don't know what happened. But they're trying to bring back this old idea that rising from the dead is this self-fulfilling wage price spiral where workers get higher wages, that gets passed on in higher prices, then workers demand still higher wages, and that gets passed on in still higher prices. Nice, frightening horror plot, but has nothing to do with the reality today. The argument we hear is that if wages were increased to keep up with inflation, around 7% right now, that itself will cause inflation. And for them, they don't care that workers didn't cause it. They will admit in polite company that workers did not cause this inflation. That's obvious. But it doesn't matter. We still have to target employment, wage growth, and consumer spending power to bring inflation down. Tim Watson, this orthodox economist who works at ANU, who's the other day tweeted out that cutting real wages in order to bring down inflation was a win-win solution. He actually called it a win-win solution because it helps to bring down inflation, and that's good for workers in the long run. But you've cut their real wages. So how is that a win-win solution? It's unbelievable, the logic, the contusions that these people jump through in order to justify targeting innocent people, millions of innocent people whose wages were going nowhere beforehand, and now they're going backward. So this is the argument behind using high interest rates and other forms of restraint, including wage restraint by employers, to keep wages down. Philip Lowe, this is the governor of the Reserve Bank, put it this way: if the supply side shocks do lead to a permanent or persistent shift in labor cost growth, inflation will not return to where it was before. Very kind of obscure language. What he's actually saying when we translate it, if workers try to win wage increases to keep up with inflation, even though they didn't cause it, that will keep inflation above our 2.5% target, and we will not let that happen, no matter what. So workers are going to have to swallow a big permanent reduction in their standard of living. That's what the real wage is. It's the value of goods and services that can be purchased with our wages. It's already fallen 4% this year, and it's going to fall more, and we have to just put up with it. You hear some of these extreme claims from some folks that if we actually allowed workers to try and protect their wages, we'd go back to the Weimar Republic or hyperinflation in Zimbabwe or something like that. The Weimar Republic, for those who didn't study history, it was the period in Germany in the 1920s. Germany was being crushed by the reparations. The government, kind of a liberal government, was trying to make ends meet. They increased the money supply, and you ended up with hyperinflation. So you had to take a wheelbarrow full of cash to go to the store and buy a loaf of bread, like this fellow. Well, Phil Coury says that he literally said, that's where we're going. We're going to the Weimar Republic if we accept the argument that wages should increase as fast as inflation. This was during the context of the federal election, remember, when Elbow said, yeah, the minimum wage anyway should be increased to keep up with the rate of inflation. What a concept. And Phil Coury and all the others jumped on it, trying to portray Elbow as economically illiterate for making such an extravagant claim. So it's like he's your cranky uncle, Phil Coury, who comes over for dinner on Sunday with the rest of your family and starts mouthing off about workers and wages and damn greedy unions. So here's a few comebacks for Uncle Phil, for crazy Uncle Phil. Why increasing wages to keep up with inflation is not going to take us back to the Weimar Republic. It is obvious that wages did not cause this problem. There's no doubt about that. So wage growth was trickling along at barely 2% a year for the last decade, dipped a little bit in the early period of the pandemic, bounced back very modestly. Today's number, as I said, was 2.6%. Meanwhile, CPI was below target for most of that period. CPI fell in the initial lockdowns, and then it started shooting up in 2021. No correlation whatsoever with wages. So wages did not cause this. There's no debate that wages did not cause this problem. If wages didn't cause the problem, how do we know that suppressing wages will solve the problem? This is the thing. You can't trust cutting wages to solve a problem that doesn't have an obvious correlation with wages. And this is what's different in the last decade of insecure work and underemployment and suppressed wages and attacks on unions. Wage growth has been so weak, it's lost the connection with consumer price inflation. This graph shows you the average annual increase in what's called the unit labor cost, ULC. Unit labor cost is a very important concept. It is the amount of labor cost built into each unit of output. So you take the growth in wages, as I mentioned, it's 2.6% today, and it was around 2% for most of the last decade, and subtract the growth in productivity, because if you're producing more and getting paid more, then the impact on unit cost is muted. So in the 2000 to 2013 period, wages were growing about 4% a year, but unit labor costs were growing at a 2.8%, and consumer price inflation was 2.9%. So the two were close, and labor costs are an important component in total costs, so that makes sense. But look what's happened since 2013. Unit labor costs were growing way lower, just 1.3%. So that's the 2% average in wages, less the growth in productivity, which wasn't great, but it was still positive. And consumer price inflation averaged well below the bank's 2.5% target, but well above unit labor costs. So even suppressing unit labor costs doesn't necessarily mean inflation will come down. In fact, we are seeing a big decline in real wages now because of the combination of long-term nominal wage stagnation with now the acceleration of inflation. So this graph from the ACTU paper I mentioned at the beginning shows the growth in real wages, not particularly great over the previous period, followed by a steep decline since 2021, and by 2023 it will be back. The wages will be back to where they were at the end of 2010. So it's like 13 years of going nowhere for Australian workers, even though their productivity has grown, and the current decline is backbreaking. In theory, it's not just enough to ask that wages keep up with inflation. Wages should keep up with inflation and productivity growth because of that unit labor cost argument that I mentioned. So inflation was 5.1%, now it's 6.1%, going to 7%. You should be able to match that and productivity growth in order to keep up with in order to preserve workers' share of the overall economic pie. So if your unit labor costs are growing more slowly than inflation, you're not causing inflation, you're restraining inflation, and that's clearly what's happening. So we've seen an enormous and growing gap between productivity, that's the light blue line at the top, that's the real output of each hour of labor, and then the real wages, what you're actually paid adjusted for inflation, the dark blue line at the bottom. And that gap has been growing throughout most of the neoliberal era, but grew dramatically during the decade, the 9 years that Abbott, Turnbull, and Morrison were in power, actively suppressing wages and attacking unions. And now the two lines are just going in completely opposite directions. And this shows, again, confirms that no, Uncle Phil, workers are not causing this, and protecting yourself against it isn't going to make it worse. So when you adjust for that, that productivity impact, you can see that workers haven't been causing inflation. Workers have actually been restraining and pulling down inflation. The increase in the last 12-month period in the national accounts in unit labor costs, in nominal unit labor costs, was 2.1%. So that's a little bit more than the 1.3% that we saw in the previous graph, but still well below the RBA's target. So workers are a disinflationary force. If you want to find out where the inflation is coming from, look at profits. Profits have expanded as a share of GDP to their highest level ever. Corporate gross profits, almost 30% of GDP now, the highest in history. And companies have used their pricing power to take advantage of the inflationary moment and increase prices far more than is required by just covering their own costs. And on a per unit basis, profits grew 14% in the last 12 months. So how come everybody stands up and worries and wrings their hands about unit labor costs, and this concept of unit profit cost doesn't even get mentioned? It doesn't even get mentioned. It's assumed that profits are just a natural return to the innovation and entrepreneurship of the owners of companies. But what we really have to worry about is wages, even though profits have grown enormously as a share of total costs. So workers' share of the economic pie has been declining dramatically. And again, this is a fundamental difference than the 1970s. This is the real unit labor cost, which shows a steady decline and a big decline in the last couple of years. Another thing to remember, Uncle Phil, labor costs are not the whole story. Labor costs are only a part of the pie. In fact, at the direct level, at the immediate direct level, on average across Australia's economy, labor costs are only 25% of a typical business's total production costs. 25%. Everything else is on materials, inputs, supplies, buildings, capital, interest, profit. Profit is a big one, and other expenses. So if in fact wages grew by as much as inflation, that's only 25% of the total slice, 25% slice of the overall pie. Even if you then included the indirect labor costs that are built into the different inputs that companies buy, you're still only slightly above a third of total costs that you could possibly say is due to higher labor costs. You can clearly see the difference between this inflation and the inflation of the 1970s in terms of what's happening to shares, factor shares of overall GDP. So since the pandemic hit, labor's share, which had been falling for decades, has fallen even more, down by over 2 full percentage points of GDP. Now, 2 percentage points is a hell of a lot of money when your GDP is $2 trillion, okay? So that alone is $40 billion or $45 billion that has been taken from workers and given to someone else. Who has it been given it to? Corporate profits have increased. They were increasing for years and years, and now they've reached sky-high levels, up 3%. Even the small business side has grown their profit share. And I know there's a whole mythology in Australia about the noble cafe owner and all of his struggles to make ends meet. And yeah, it can be hard to run a small business for sure, but even small business profits have increased in this current inflationary moment. So remember, it is companies that set prices for things. So again, this idea that workers are to blame when it's companies that actually set the price is just nonsense. So this is the bottom line for workers. This is a story this is a chart that tells 1,000 words, and it's 1,000 words about the history of neoliberalism, the causes of it, the rationale for neoliberalism, and then its impact. So in the 60s and 70s, when workers were confident the economy was managed for full employment and private wages were supplemented by a growing social wage, workers' share of the economic pie rose steadily. And this was a good thing. This was a era when average workers saw their standard of living increase every year. And the generation that came after each generation was better off than the generation before. That isn't true anymore. That reached a peak in the late 70s, early 80s with the beginning of neoliberalism. And neoliberalism has its own unique history in Australia, of course. And then the worker share has been declining ever since. And now with the post-pandemic inflation combined with a near decade of stagnation and wage suppression, the worker share has fallen to 45% of GDP in the latest data. It'll probably fall even further in the current data when we get it, the next data. So this tells you everything. Neoliberalism was not about growing the pie. It was not about rational allocation of economic activity. It was about redividing the pie from workers to the owners of businesses, and that's exactly what has happened. So the corporate share of GDP has increased throughout the neoliberal era as well, and is now about twice as high as it was in the late 70s when we were all worried about the wage price spiral. So this is a night and day story, and there's no possibility that this experience that we're seeing today is a wage price spiral, anything like that. It's more of a profit price spiral. So let me take the last couple of minutes, Luke, and talk about how do we fix this. I think there's, in a way, two pieces to the solution. The first one is we have to protect ourselves against this current inflation. This inflation was not caused by us. It was caused by corporate power, and we have to protect ourselves against it by winning wages that keep up with inflation, by indexing social benefits like job seeker and others, age pension, indexing them fast and efficiently to inflation and then some. Stronger funding for public and community services and other ways to support people who are suffering because of this inflation. That's how we protect ourselves, but that doesn't solve the inflation. We can find fairer solutions to the core problem of inflation, recognizing the unique sort of one-off aspect of the pandemic-related inflation and the other factors, supply chains, the energy price issue. We could regulate energy prices like many countries do. There's no reason that we have to pay more for Australian energy because of something that happened on the world oil's futures market. Governments can also directly bring down prices by reducing the cost or making free some of the crucial public services that are consumed by workers. We saw that happen with childcare when Morrison made childcare free for about 4 months. In the early days of the pandemic, the CPI fell. Then he slapped the full fees back on, and that's when the CPI started taking off. We could do the same with aged care and home care and public transit and other public services. If we have to reduce spending power in the economy, and it's definitely a secondary factor, that's not the main cause of inflation. If we have to, we can do it by targeting those who can best afford it, number one, and who have profited from inflation, number two. So that means windfall taxes on the energy companies and the supermarket chains who have actually made out very well during this inflationary episode, and fairer taxes on high-income households who, first of all, disproportionately own those companies, and secondly, can best afford to pay. Some of it is just going to be a matter of patience, and even 6 or 7% inflation is not the end of the world if we have protected people against it. And some of those factors are going to cool off. As I mentioned, we're already seeing it. But in the meantime, we absolutely have to reject the idea that workers are to blame, and that more austerity for workers, in this case, monetary austerity, is required. So, Luke, thank you, and the Search Foundation for having me and for your patience. And I look forward to discussion and questions anytime that we've got left. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. It was brilliant. So much content in so short a time. I know we're up to about 19 minutes left. Sorry.
That's what productivity growth is all about, Luke. Talking faster so that you can get more words out in the limited amount of time.
That's right. And doing it with new technologies as well. No, that was absolutely brilliant. Particularly, thank you for suggesting some things which we can do, immediately to address this issue. And you were rejecting the idea that workers should have to pay for it. We've got a number of questions in the chat and in the Q&A, but I will jump to that one, a question around that, which I was thinking about, and Tim Diamond, comrade from WA, has talked about. Has asked, can Jim talk about what an alternative monetary policy might look like? For example, can we have austerity, i.e. lowering prices, without misery, that is losing our jobs? I'm very interested, you mentioned the history of it, that neoliberalism at its core is a monetary and macroeconomic attack on workers' rights. It's a bit like an air war, carpet bombing from above, while unions and the left and others have often been working at the micro level in disputes and often in the fiscal side, which is obviously macroeconomic as well. But we haven't really got popularized proposals to change the way the monetary system works. I know there's some proposals in the UK and so forth, but can you speak a little bit to that, as well as your other suggestions about how we can address inflation in the short term?
Oh, well, that's a great question. Thank you, Luke and Tim, for that question. So the way monetary policy works right now is the Reserve Bank has this gigantic sledgehammer. They've got a toolbox and there's one thing in it, a gigantic sledgehammer, which is the power to lift or cut the overall interest rate that affects the whole banking system and the whole economy. And they literally don't know what else to do. There's the old joke, if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. If all you got is a sledgehammer, then you get inflation too high or too low, you're going to pull out the sledgehammer and you're going to use it. And it is completely undiscriminating. Okay, so when you increase the interest rate, you increase borrowing costs for everyone, whether you're doing something useful with the money you borrow or not. Okay, so if you're building new housing supply or investing in new industrial capacity, or building new transportation infrastructure to address supply chain shortages, you're going to not be able to do that, just as if you were borrowing money to speculate on property or cryptocurrency. So it's enormous, and it's undiscriminating, untargetable, and then wielded by this institution, the RBA, which has been given this phony independence. Everyone says the RBA is independent. It's nonsense. The RBA is owned and ultimately accountable to the government. They've created this sort of myth of independence to try and insulate the RBA from popular outrage at the impacts of the RBA's actions. So they're trying to take it out of politics. That means take it out of democracy, really, in order to allow it to do painful things without being questioned. That's what the myth of central bank independence is all about. Now, what else could we do? What else could we do? Could we, first of all, be more discriminating in the use of the interest rate lever? I think we could. So we, in that ACTU paper, we proposed the RBA should work with the prudential lending regulators to limit the way that easier credit or cheaper credit flows into non-productive or speculative activity. And also the financial regulators, the financial securities regulators, to limit leveraged trading in financial assets, for example. So there's ways that you could increase the interest rates for less productive or less useful investments while preserving access to credit for things that we need, like investment in real productive capacity, new housing supply, and so on. Ultimately, though, you're going to need more. You're going to need more sort of public and democratic control over the banking system itself. So right now we have mostly private banking system. Sorry, I just have to stand up and wave my arms for a moment.
No worries.
There's my energy efficient lights again. The private banks create money out of thin air when they issue loans to people. And we've kind of outsourced the job of credit creation to private banks. And that is another way that we've lost control over how credit is created and where it's used. So public banks, social investment banks, credit unions, those are other ways to try and have a more progressive approach to credit creation and monetary policy. So there's lots to do in that. None of that's going to happen overnight. So none of that is going to solve the current inflation challenge, but they are demands that progressives should put on the agenda. I talk a little bit about that in later chapters of Economics for Everyone, the book that you kindly promoted, Luke, at the beginning of our session. And I do think it's something that we have to wrap our minds around, because just arguing that the bank shouldn't increase interest rates is not enough. Okay, I'm very uncomfortable with how we kind of get trapped into that. The RBA is going to increase interest rates, and that's going to hurt, and it's wrong. But our response has to be much more than don't increase interest rates. Because even when interest rates were low, that big sledgehammer didn't work. It lost much of its stimulative value, and we saw big side effects like the property price bubble and financial speculation that made rich people even richer. So we need more than just higher or lower interest rates, and I think that was the spirit of Tim's question. So thank you for it.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that. And again, I encourage people who didn't quite catch my introduction to pick up Economics for Everyone. We had another couple of questions there. One from Roger Keys about a national living income for everyone. And again, you addressed this in your summary, your slide about things that we could do now about increasing payment, welfare payments for people who are being most hard hit by the cost of living increase, particularly people on New Start. And I'll mention Don Sutherland here, who's working with the Living Incomes for Everyone campaign. People should get behind that campaign and go to his events as well. So the idea of a national living income for everyone, you've already suggested that we peg increases in the New Start, pension, so forth, make sure people maintain their incomes. That goes to the question of the fiscal situation, the federal budget. We've got a new Labor government. There's a lot of hope around this government. People can see that it's an improvement on the previous government. Many people on this call campaigned, day and night for the election of that government, or for the removal of the other government. But I think pretty much everyone on this webinar also knows that the noises coming from that government are not encouraging in terms of where they're going to go with their budget. But they're not saying they're going to increase New Start. What's the role of the federal budget in both controlling and also adding to inflation, as you said? I recall an article you wrote before the 2019 federal election, which I kept on my phone tabs because it was such a great article explaining why deficits didn't necessarily contribute to poor economic outcomes. And I think was it Rogoff and Reinhardt, were proved incorrect about this idea that deficits would, fiscal deficits cause economic disaster for nations. Clearly not the case. Is there any justification for the idea of severely cutting or indeed keeping New Start at its current rate because that contributes to inflation, in your view?
Right. Well, certainly we have to argue that fiscal policy should be more active and play a bigger role in overall macroeconomic management. Under neoliberalism, the idea was dominant that the central bank should be in charge with that sledgehammer it has of managing the overall level of economic activity, and governments should not try to fine-tune the economy through proactive fiscal policy, whether that was stimulus during bad times or fiscal tightening during good times. Now that argument was never believable, and Australia actually proved that it wasn't before many others. Australia's fiscal response, not monetary response, fiscal response to the GFC in 2008 is the reason why Australia is the only OECD country that didn't have a recession in the GFC. And the fiscal response to COVID was enormous and incredibly important. So the evidence is very clear that fiscal policy needs to be there, including fiscal policy to manage inflation, both to get employment stronger when we need it to, because that low interest rates, as I mentioned, isn't the only solution, but also to make sure that the economy is sustainable and that the benefits of economic growth are shared by those who need it the most. So active fiscal policy is important, and this fairer anti-inflation strategy that I talked about at the end of the presentation includes a bunch of fiscal policy measures. Fiscal policy to put money in the hands of people who need it and take it out of the hands of people who don't need it when you're worried that overall spending power is too strong. Again, high interest rates, if their goal is to limit spending power, does nothing for rich people. Rich people don't need to borrow money to buy a yacht. They've got all the money they need. So that's not going to affect their spending. It's only going to affect the spending of people who are indebted. And in that regard, it's very unfair and in some ways very ineffective, because you got this huge swath of the economy, which is the luxury consumption of high income people, that is untouched by high interest rates. So go after them with taxes. So the demand for windfall taxes on energy companies and others, and the demand to cancel these stage 3 tax cuts, which would be an enormous blow to the whole tradition of progressive income taxation. Those are very, very relevant now, not just for fairness reasons, but for anti-inflation reasons.
I'm glad you mentioned those stage 3 tax cuts. They're, I think the best word from them is egregious. We've got a number of questions, but we've only about 7 minutes, and I want to operate, as always, a progressive speaking list. So I'm going to go to a question from Natasha Watt. And this, I suppose, goes partly to your expertise as a democratizer and demystifier of economic knowledge, as we mentioned at the start. She asks, how do we translate this to workers to give confidence to those taking strike action that they're on the side of good? And how do we communicate this better down to the reality of your industry, neighbour to neighbour? So it's a question, not so much on your economic knowledge side, but your side as an educator.
Yeah, well, thank you, Natasha. You're 100% right that that's a critical part of what we need to do in our progressive movement, is communicate our ideas and make them accessible and cut through the fake jargon that mystifies economics as it's conventionally practiced, and including that's a great point you make. Give people who are on strike for wage increases to match the rate of inflation, give them the knowledge and the confidence that they are legitimate in what they're doing. This isn't greedy. This isn't, unfeasible. It is absolutely feasible and absolutely legitimate. And in fact, the only way we're going to win wage increases that keep up with inflation is if we fight for it, politically and industrially. So there's no easy solution, especially when you don't own the newspapers and the TV stations. But we have lots of opportunities through our videos and our newsletters and our email lists and our social media to try and find convincing ways to get that information out there. I'll just put out one boast right now. My colleague at the Center for Future Work, Greg Jericho, you'll know him from his columns in The Guardian, but he's also our policy director for labor markets at the center. Just today, we started a new feature called Off the Charts. Off the Charts, because he's a genius in graphing and statistics and so on. And what he's going to do is he and other members of our team will put out a graph that tells 1,000 words, kind of like that graph I had about the declining labor share of GDP, telling 1,000 words about neoliberalism. Post it with a very, very short description in easily shareable formats as a way of, just helping to get the word out. So that's just one way of many. But we have to be creative and energetic in finding ways to share this information that empower people to do what's just and what's necessary. And right now, that means fighting like hell to defend ourselves against inflation that we didn't cause.
Thank you for that. I've posted the link to the Centre for Future Work, and you can also find, I previously posted the link to the Australia Institute's article today pointing out that wages aren't causing inflation. I think that's a very important point to make, but I think the point that you've made, that wages have not kept up, it's not just inflation, but it's also inflation and productivity. That's where wages should definitely be, keeping up. And of course, the national share of wages versus profit share of national income, very important. And something which I think is important for many of us who aren't in industries where it's immediately obvious what our production, produces. If you're a public school teacher or someone like that, you're not producing widgets that get sold down the line. So to understand that overall, the productivity that you as a worker have contributed to, it's reflected in those national accounts. So thank you for producing the graph on that and emphasizing that in your talk as well. We've got 4 minutes to go. I know our comrade Don Sutherland is itching to ask a question. I don't know if Don is ready for me to put him on camera. I've just asked him in the chat, but I'll give it a go and see if he can. He's posted a link to his blog and also a long section about the RBA's charter. So I'm just going to allow Don to come on if he can hear us and ask his question in person.
G'day,
oh, there he is, you beauty. Very good.
G'day, Luke. Thank you very much. I'm speaking from Ponrabble country, never ceded, on the banks of the Tame River, also known as Kalamana Lukuka. The question I've raised is about the Reserve Bank, but I guess a quick preamble is that firstly that Jim, this discussion paper has been out for just over a week now, I think, and it is a discussion paper, and I think it's a terrific step forward, especially relevant to its purpose, which is to, I assume, is genuinely interested in creating a discussion leading into the summit. Now, so I hope there is more discussion, and there needs to be, because this document actually deserves to be studied. Partly because it has got lots of useful information, some of which we've heard from Jim, and there's others, but also because I think its whole framework reveals a lot of problems as well in how it understands certain things. And one of them is how it understands the problem of business investment. I haven't got time to go into that, but I think the way it deals with business investment is not in the real world. And that has serious implications for jobs in the transition that is necessary to deal with climate change. The question, a second example actually, is more related directly to my question. The Reserve Bank's mandate, I posted into the chat for everyone to see. The discussion paper has actually got this wrong. They want the Reserve Bank to have a reformed mandate and also an operational strategy. In fact, the mandate in the Act, if you read it, is actually, and I'm happy to be educated otherwise, there's actually not much wrong with it. The first priority is the stability of the currency. In other words, the price of various forms of money and the uses to which it might be put. The second mandate is the maintenance of full employment in Australia. This is its statutory mandate we're talking about. The economic prosperity and welfare of the people of Australia. In other words, inflation is not mentioned in the statutory mandate. Now, what would we want to reform about that? What we need to take on is the neoliberal ideology about how capitalism should be managed, surely. It's the ideology that infects the whole thing. And we could go further. I haven't got time to do that because of its interrelation with the way in which the annual wage review will consider the economy. So my question is, why does the discussion paper get this so wrong?
Thanks for that question, and we've probably got 1 minute to talk with it, especially as Jim's lights have gone, but you're perfectly okay on the screen, by the way.
Yeah, okay, if I look like a goblin or a zombie or something, that's why. It isn't the attack of the zombies, it's the attack of my energy-saving lights. Don, thank you very much for that. The paper very carefully does not say change the RBA's mandate. Because you're 100% right. The actual mandate in the charter of the RBA has those 3 points: protection of the currency, full employment, and national prosperity, and doesn't even mention inflation. So the goal is not to change the mandate, but clearly the RBA doesn't act in consistency with that mandate. Operationally, the RBA's instructions given it by the government have been to target 2.5% inflation and nothing else. Now it's supposed to take those other things into account. What would be the
reform mandate?
What's that?
It says reform mandate. You want to reform the mandate. Now, I'm open to that idea.
Right.
But what would you reform out of what it currently says?
Well, I'll go back and check the precise wording, but it's not just the mandate; it's the operations of the Reserve Bank, which have had nothing to do with the mandate. So your point is correct, Don. Those are the things that are in the mandate, and some of them, I mean, the strong currency thing can be a Trojan horse for anti-inflation policy, but certainly full employment and national prosperity is what we're ultimately interested in. But it won't be the words on a piece of paper about the mandate of the bank. It's going to be the politics and who has the power over how the bank actualizes its role, and that is absolutely within the power of the government to give the Reserve Bank different marching orders.
No worries. Thank you for that. Look, we always say we finish sharp, so our guests can go off and do their things. And it's 9 o'clock in Vancouver, and Jim's probably had a very long day. This has been a brilliant discussion. The good news is that Jim is not an ivory tower academic. As mentioned, he's on Twitter and on Facebook, and he's always willing to discuss and answer questions from comrades. I think his email's on the Centre for Future Work website as well, at futurework.org.au, and you can almost certainly leave comments on things that are on there as well. So Jim's not hard to find if you want to keep up the conversation. I know we haven't had been able to get to all our questions. So what I'm saying is keep up the conversation directly with Jim through his Twitter, Facebook, and through the Centre for Future Work. I want to thank everybody for coming. All our questions people have asked us has been brilliant, and all the comments in the chat. As mentioned, we've got our next event on the 8th of September at the MUA building in Sydney, at the MUA boardroom with Thomas Mayer. Search members will get an email about that in coming days, and it will be posted on our Facebook and our Twitter. But for now, I want to thank Jim Stanford so much. Thank you, comrade. That was absolutely packed with brilliant information, and thank you so much for making a time to talk with us today.
Thank you, Luke, and to everyone in Search for the great work you're doing. A real pleasure to join you. Thank you so much.
All the best. See you in Sydney.